Also, European officials are urging Trump's administration to commit several thousand troops to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine in case of a ceasefire. According to Bloomberg, only American military presence will make this peacekeeping mission a credible one. What is your reaction to this, and do you believe that only US military presence will make this mission a credible one?
I think there are a couple of issues here, Daniel. I think American presence on the ground would be a very powerful deterrent for President Putin. Unfortunately, I don't think that's coherent with where President Trump's head is at the moment. I think he has been very critical of NATO. He's been very critical of nations within NATO that believe that they can just hide under the umbrella of security that NATO provides, but not pay their way. And therefore, he wants to encourage European NATO countries to step up, not only with money, but also military capability and equipment onto the ground. So I suspect he will not see Ukraine as an American problem. He will see this as a great example of a European challenge and will therefore be pushing very hard, not only for European countries to get involved and find a solution, but also use this as a catalyst to increase defence spending across Europe. You'll know that he's currently seeking 5% of GDP for NATO countries. It used to be NATO was setting a target of 2%, and there are still a third of NATO countries that fail to meet that low bar. If it goes up to 3, 4, or 5%, which is exactly what America is seeking to achieve, that will certainly provide the West with a more robust military deterrence. But whether those politicians have the appetite for that at the moment, we'll have to wait and see.
Let's cover also Vladimir Putin and Kremlin. Russian dictator Putin believes that he has achieved key objectives in the war against Ukraine, according to Reuters. However, Putin is frustrated about the state of Russia's economy. Meanwhile, Russian elite becoming more favorable to the peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine, according to the Reuters sources. Don't you think that these developments can indicate Russia's willingness to settle the war, to negotiate a ceasefire?
Daniel, that may be true, but it does feel more like hope than expectation. As we've said before, I think sanctions do have an impact on Russia's economy. There is no doubt that inflationary pressures are building. That with, I think it's about 30% of spending now on defense, that this is not a sustainable model for Russia. However, if I put myself in the leadership shoes of Putin, I would be pushing very hard at the moment so that when, not if, there is a negotiation, that he's in a very strong position. That's why I believe, even though it's winter, even though there's no undergrowth to hide behind, even though it's very difficult to dig trenches in the ground, and traditionally Russia has not been on the offensive in the winter, they have been pushing very hard this winter despite the losses. All of that appears to indicate that Russia is trying to get itself into as strong as possible position ready for that negotiation. I think that's also coherent. If you remember, the Ukrainians did an invasion of Russia into the Kursk region. And although Ukraine has been pushed out of a good proportion of that enclave now, it still has a very credible military presence. And I think Putin has been pushing hard in the Donbass to try to force Ukraine pull out its forces. And it's also been using North Korean forces in the Kursk region to try to bolster up the Russian effort. But Ukraine has held firm. It is still having a robust defense. And therefore, it looks likely, if we do end up with some sort of negotiation, that Ukraine's holding some of the territory in Russia might be a useful bargaining chip as well. But back to your central question, do we think the pressures building on Putin will force him to the table? I don't think so. Will they be an element, a factor? I have no doubt that he would like to see the war end. He does not know if just how powerful his support is back in Russia, because he controls all of the media. But it's pretty clear that the oligarchs, the generals, where the real power lies, they cannot be happy with the way this war is going. They cannot be happy with the various sanctions, that they're not able to live their lives and enjoy their wealth. There's no doubt pressure is building on Putin, but whether that crack in the dam opens in the next day, week, months, or years, it's very difficult to tell.
Also, US President Donald Trump says that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky want to make a deal, but Trump is not really confident about whether Putin would like to make a deal. From your perspective, why is there such focus on President Zelenskyy's willingness to settle the war, to make a deal?
I think we've got to be careful, Daniel, about the language here. You know, President Trump has made his fortune around doing deals. You're hired, you're fired. He's made his fortune in real estate, and he knows that a deal is to be done. That's what he puts his, and he's doing that with American foreign policy. He's doing that with a lot of the headlines that he's been grabbing and some of the orders that he's been signing in the first week of his time. What he's effectively saying is, this war isn't to anybody's benefit. We need to bring it to a close. The concern is that, of course, Trump will be simply concerned with having successfully ceased the war in Ukraine, having that on his CV. The problem is that if you don't resolve the underlying problems, in other words, create the security for Ukraine long term, make it clear that Putin is not rewarded for these ambitions, then the danger is, what next? We haven't even talked about Belarus, but that's another country which Russia has been gradually seizing control of. It hasn't attacked militarily, but it's now got itself embedded in that country, and almost certainly that will be the next prize that President Putin will effectively seize. This is not the end of not the beginning of the end with Ukraine. It looks like the end of the beginning.
What would it take for US President Donald Trump to help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I think that depends on what the position of strength is. I as a military guy, I say I don't believe sanctions are going to solve this. I think President Putin has to think that he will get badly damaged if he continues. And the only way to do that is to bring Western power to bear. Western air power would be the first obvious choice, because it would absolutely dominate Russia. Russia would not have an answer to that. And Ukraine has done it spectacularly well, but it's very difficult to fight a modern war without having air cover, which it doesn't have. So I do think that if President Trump really wants to get this war to an end and force President Putin to the table, military involvement is the way to do it. Whether he's prepared to threaten that or not, it'd be interesting to see what his advisors say. There's no appetite in America that I can see at the moment for getting involved in a war in Ukraine. But ultimately, the only language which President Putin understands is that of military threat. That is, it seems to me the West has to stand toe to toe with President Putin. Otherwise, he might stop because it suits him. But whether it actually stops him coming again, that's another matter.
So you're confident that only a no-fly zone will help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I'm not saying that's the only way. I really hope that President Putin is brought to the table without having any force applied. But my worry is that if you look at it from a negotiating position, President Zelensky doesn't appear to have much to play on that negotiation, whereas President Putin seems to have most of the aces in his hand. And therefore, how do you create a bit more balance so that there is a meaningful negotiation where there are compromises on both sides and ultimately peace is secured? I don't see that happening without military engagement, and the no-fly zone is probably the least risk, but the most obvious benefit way to do that.
And what could be the most riskiest type of deployment to Ukraine? From your perspective, if Donald Trump, for example, goes all in and says that he would like Ukraine to actually win this war?
I'm not sure that there's a risk. I mean, ultimately, the risk people keep talking about is the threat of starting nuclear war. And I'm very confident that that is not on the table. People forget I was in the military when we were in the Cold War. We lived under the threat of nuclear war. It's abhorrent. Nuclear weapons are dreadful. But their very existence means that it will be mutually assured destruction were anybody to use nuclear weapons. So I'm confident that Russia would have everything to lose and nothing to gain by triggering a nuclear war. What the West has to do is match Putin, stand toe to toe with him. And therefore, I think, whilst it would undoubtedly cause frictions and escalations, I'm confident that unless you deal with people like Putin, very aggressively, then we will have this problem returning again. Just imagine other nuclear nations like Iran, like North Korea, when they get nuclear weapons, not if, when they do, if people aren't prepared to stand toe to toe with them, we are effectively saying that those countries can do what they like around the world. That is not a world in which I am comfortable at all. We need to be able to stand firm. We need to be able to stand up to bullies like Putin. And I think the only way to do that robustly is military engagement. I hope that is something that's on the table, because otherwise I worry that President Putin will pause, regenerate, and in a few years he'll be back again.
From your perspective, so even if the West enters the fight in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will not use any kind of nuclear weapons.
I think Putin will be absolutely stupid to trigger a nuclear war, which he knows he cannot win. Putin is all about his legacy. It's all about restoring Russian greatness again. If Russia starts something that ends up leveling Moscow and getting rid of his legacy, then his legacy will be absolutely awful. I'm very confident that he will do lots of threatening behavior, but the whole premise of nuclear weapons is neither side wins. President Putin is the one who has invaded Ukraine. President Putin is the one responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives being lost and for millions of people being relocated. We have allowed him the luxury of believing that he is not vulnerable to attack. We must correct that if we are to stop this happening in the future.
Let's cover also Russia's position in Syria. So according to the recent reports, Syria's new government has terminated Russia's 50-year lease for the Tartus naval base, forcing Russian Navy to evacuate its fleet and military personnel. What is your take on such developments, and how can this influence Russia's position around the globe and during the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, I mean, we haven't got time to go into the detail of Syria, but there is no doubt that Russian forces helped keep Assad in power for many, many years. The Russian Air Force particularly bombed a lot of the soldiers on the ground and therefore stopped them presenting a threat. Therefore, there'll be little love lost with the new administration in Syria, and no surprises that Russia has been thrown out. I think what was interesting is, of course, that the uprising happened at a time when also you've got the forces of Hezbollah that would normally have gone to the aid of Assad. They've been badly mauled with the fight with Israel as well. So it was a sort of case of opportunism, and it showed just how thinly that Russian forces are spread and how much that things can change very swiftly. Russia likes to cause mischief around the world, inciting uprisings just to cause issues around the world in support of their own agendas. I think this has been an interesting wake-up call for Russia, and it will be very keen, I suspect. It's another reason why they will want to end the war in Ukraine, at least in the near term, so they can consolidate, lick their wounds, and work out what they're going to do next.
Let's also cover the US foreign policy. Donald Trump is serious about taking control over Greenland. And according to Financial Times publication, there was a really interesting phone call between Trump and Prime Minister of Denmark. From a strategic point of view, would Greenland make US army, US power more stronger around the globe?
I think, Daniel, you have to look at its geography. The shortest distance between America and Russia goes over Greenland. And therefore, there is a military base, a US military base on Greenland that looks at early warning, provides early warning notification for Russian missiles coming over the pole there. In addition, though, there's a lot of natural resources in Greenland. And although Denmark effectively owns Greenland, the Greenlanders themselves, there's not many of them, couldn't really present a realistic defense if Russia, China, or somebody else decided to invade them. And that country is strategically important, not just for America, but for the security of the West. So much as I don't think that President Trump is going to invade, it does highlight just how important that region is. But you have to, I think, Daniel, we've talked about Trump a lot today. One of the things that I think he's very big on is rhetoric, not always so good at delivering. And I think another area where he talked about the Panama Canal and threatening that he was going to seize that potentially by military force. But if you look at the history of that canal, you know, it was initially started by France, but basically the project failed because it was so vast. America took it on, opened in 1914, and America ran it till 1977. And then they handed over a period of 20 years for the Panamanian Canal Authority to run it. But of course, since then, the charges for going through that strait have risen. My understanding is the average charge for a ship is now $50,000. And President Trump has said, wait a minute, we done that, we paid for it, we ran it, we gave it to you, and now you're charging us $50,000 for every crossing, and China is stepping in to help run it. No, we can't have that. And all he's doing is he's threatening to set the scenes for a negotiation. So I think a bit like Greenland, there's a lot of rhetoric around Trump. Let's just see how it gradually forms into policy, because it's one thing talking about it, it's quite another doing anything about it.
Also, some military experts suggest that obtaining Greenland for the US would be really beneficial, for example, for intercepting Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile in case of their launch. What is your take on that? Do you agree with such a logic?
Well, as I said, Daniel, you know, the US has a base on Greenland, and it's there to track missiles coming from Russia, because the shortest distance from Russia to America is over the top of Greenland. So we have seen a lot of Western nations haven't really focused on long-range ballistic missiles as a threat since the Cold War. But of course, Russia has been launching those into Ukraine regularly, and Iran has launched a whole load into Israel. And all of a sudden, that's heightened all nations' awareness of what's their ability to detect, track, and destroy these long-range weapons. I know I speak to you now from the United Kingdom. Although we have radar setups, we used to have missile systems like Bloodhound that were available to take out such missiles. Today, we don't have that defense because we haven't invested in it, because we haven't thought it's a realistic threat to our country. I think the attacks over the last couple of decades have demonstrated there's an increased threat to all of our nations, that we have to be aware that long-range ballistic missiles can cause a lot of damage, and therefore you need to have preparations, not only to detect them, but also track them and destroy them. And that is why areas like Greenland are so vital.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.